Hello and welcome to this video about how to host a remote phone bank with Swing Left. I'm Colleen McCarthy. I'm an assistant field director with Swing Left. Here's our agenda today. I'm going to talk a little bit at first generally about remote phone banks, and then I'm going to walk you through each step of preparing, planning, performing, and then wrapping up after the event and leave you with some resources. So let's get started. The first thing I want to mention is that on this video today, I'm not going to be teaching you how to use specific phone bank tools. There are lots of them and they change constantly. And this is something that we at Swing Left can definitely help you with when you decide that you want to host a particular phone bank for a campaign or for a Democratic Party. But I'm not going to go over all of them now. So please reach out to us or the campaign that you're working with or the group that you're working with for help on that specific phone bank tool when you do encounter it. The things you should know is there's basically two types of phone banks. There's what's called a predictive dialer, and that is an automated dialer where the phone bank volunteer will get on the dialer on their computer. They will see the script and the computer will do the calling for them and will just send through any calls where it's able to actually reach someone on the phone. And so all the hangups, all the voicemails, all the wrong numbers, all of the disconnects will hopefully not get sent through to the volunteer. So they'll just be waiting for a live person to actually talk to. Those types of dialers are often used closer to an election because they can be pretty expensive to run. Often there's manual phone banking. One of the most common software is OpenVPB from NGP Van. And that's where the volunteer will need their computer because they'll be using that to read the script and see the information about the caller and record data. But they will be making phone calls on their own phone based on the data that the website, the software provides them, the voter's name and information. So those are the two basic types. And if you need more support on a particular tool, feel free to reach out. So we'll start with the structure of a remote phone bank. These can look many different ways. Here are two general ideas, and I'll give you some specific examples after that. Obviously, if we were all joining each other in person to run a phone bank, it might look very much like someone shows up at an office and they get trained and they sit down and they make calls. But when we're working virtually, there's a number of different ways that you can do it. And I generally describe these as sort of flexible and fixed phone banks. So flexible phone banks are often used even when we can join each other and meet in person to do a phone bank. They instead are set up online so that somebody can sign up for a phone bank and make calls whenever they want. Usually they're sent an email with all the information they need to know to make the calls from home on their own time, and they are given a wide window of any day, maybe 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. when they can make phone calls. This is definitely an option and might be appropriate for some of the phone banks you're doing now. There's also another option which many groups are choosing, which is what I call a fixed phone bank. That's where people join together at some point on a video conference, whether that be before making the calls, a couple of days before making the calls, or right before making the calls. And they get trained. They learn about who they're calling for. They get a chance to ask questions. Then they go ahead and make calls. They are offered a way to get support and help if they're having trouble with the script or the tech. And there would be also a debrief at some point. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the structure of fixed phone banks because many of our groups are using those as a way to continue to engage their volunteers, but also make sure they make phone calls. I'll reference at the bottom of this slide that there is a link to our remote phone bank guide and host kit. If you go to that URL, you can see much more detailed information on everything that I'm presenting here. Here's some example structures for a fixed phone bank. The one on the left involves planning an online meeting, a video conference on a few days before you're planning to have your volunteers make the calls, and doing training, going over the script, talking about tech and data coding. And then you ask everyone to come back and make calls on Saturday. You will likely potentially still have a phone bank launch, a quick launch to get people going. So you'll have them join a video conference or a Zoom call. And then you may stay on that Zoom call while people make calls so that you're available for tech support or questions. Some teams like to have everyone stay on the call when they're making calls because that encourages, both camaraderie among volunteers. It also encourages that accountability that people stay and actually make those phone calls and don't stop. If they see other people that they're watching on the video conference make phone calls. That usually works pretty well as long as people mute themselves on the video conference and then make those calls, and you as the phone bank host wait and are there if anyone needs any tech support. And then we'll talk about debrief later and why a debrief is important, but you may ask everyone to join at the end of your phone bank, your remote phone bank shift, to debrief the calls that they made, what they heard, recommendations they might have. This can also be done, as you see on the right, all in one meeting. You could decide to train people, host the phone bank on Zoom or on a video call, provide help. If it's a little bit longer time frame, you might offer a break or a check-in and also do a debrief. So those are different options to think about. You can come up with your own structure or version of these. You may need to adjust based on the type of volunteers you have, whether they're new or veteran, and the type of calls that you're making. So let's talk about preparing for your remote phone bank. The first step, obviously, is to plan your event. You may already have identified who you're calling for, a campaign or a Democratic Party or some sort of project. You may already have that in mind. If you don't, but you still want to get your volunteers making phone calls, that's a great idea because it's a good way to train your volunteers early. You can connect with any Swing Left staff or your regional organizer, and they'll be happy to help you. Once you get access to the phone bank that you're planning to have your volunteers call on, the very first thing I recommend is making calls yourself, testing the script, testing the phone bank technology, getting a sense of how it works. As I mentioned early on, everything is slightly different and changes from phone bank to phone bank, even if you're using the same software you might have used before. So it's really important that you're familiar with it, you identify any issues, and you address those either with us or with the campaign or group that you're working with for the phone bank. You'll want to choose an audio-video conferencing tool. Our virtual organizing hub, the link you can see there, /virtual-organizing, gives you some information about how you can get access to borrowing a Zoom account from us if you need that, or just recommendations on finding your own video conferencing tool. You will use that definitely for the training, for the debrief, and many of our teams are having volunteers, as I mentioned before, stay on the Zoom if possible while they're making calls to increase accountability. You'll want to post your event at swingleft.org/events. There's a remote phone bank button there you can click, and a really easy form to post on Mobilize, our events management tool. Then you can use the link to that event once you post on Mobilize to invite your network. And then I recommend another step, which you may have already done, which is to identify a co-host. There are a lot of moving parts with phone banks, especially when you're doing them online. It can be really helpful to have a co-host who can split the duties with you. As I mentioned, if you need a Zoom account to host your remote phone bank, we have a plan for that. We offer a number of different Zoom accounts that you can borrow for your phone bank. Here is the email that you can send an email to. Let us know about your event, the date, the time, the length, the link from Mobilize, and whether you need help from us on that day. This is also on our virtual organizing hub. So now you're ready to prepare for your event. You have people signing up already on your Mobilize event, and now you're ready to really get down to the specifics. So you should definitely test your video conferencing tool and get training if needed. I recommend testing the video conferencing tool with your phone bank software. This is not as much an issue with some of the manual phone banks, such as with OpenVPB. You can easily run a video conference at the same time as you're logged into OpenVPB. But with some of the dialers, it's possible that there's some interactions between the audio for Zoom for someone who's making calls, a volunteer, and the video conferencing tool. And so there might be some different things you need to do. For instance, I asked volunteers on a recent phone bank, or I offered that they could leave the computer audio on Zoom, that's an option, while they're making calls, and then we can't hear them, we don't have to worry about them being muted, and they also won't hear other people talking while they're making the calls. But it leaves the Zoom on so they can jump in chat, ask questions, or join audio pretty quickly whenever they need it, if they have questions. But there's just, you just want to check to make sure all your technologies that you're going to be using at the same time works together. So definitely recommend testing it. And if you're new to Zoom, we have training that you can find on our virtual organizing hub, and you can get trained on Zoom also. You will likely want to create a volunteer instructions guide. What do I mean by that? That is a Google Doc or another type of document where you provide all the links and details and tips and tricks for making phone calls. This is particularly important if you're doing a flexible phone bank where you'll just be sending someone a document and telling them how to make calls. But it's also important for a more structured remote phone bank, something that the volunteer can look at while they're making calls and can also click on whatever link they need to get to the remote phone bank itself. It's usually a URL. There is a template for a sample volunteer instructions guide. There's actually two that are included in our remote phone bank guide that I mentioned at the beginning, and I will be showing you that link again so you can see an example of a volunteer instruction guide and what you might want to include in it. You're going to want to help volunteers prepare. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And then also prepare your training agenda and rehearse it. We have some sample slides for a phone bank training and orientation that you can copy and make your own, and those will be included in the resources at the end of this presentation. So how do you prepare your attendees? Usually there's just a few things that attendees need to do before they join a remote phone bank. Those are things you'll want to send to them before the day of the event. For some of the phone banks, you'll need to have them create a login ahead of time. That's true for OpenVPB. They may want to set up a Google Voice. This is optional. It's if people feel more comfortable calling through a different number, they can install the Google Voice app on their cell phone. This is, of course, only relevant for manual phone banks if you're calling through your computer on a dialer that's taken care of for you. And you'll need to let them know the link to join the video conference or video conferences. You can see here on the image that this is an example of providing information in the registration email that goes out when somebody registers for a phone bank on Mobilize. So there is a field when you're setting up your Mobilize event. It's called Additional Details, which allows you to include information like a link to instructions, the video conference link, instructions on creating a login, all the things that you might want to do that someone will get automatically when they register for your event on Mobilize. There's more information at this link that you see here at the bottom, which will walk you through how to make sure that happens, to make sure that somebody gets the information they need when they register for your event. You might host pre-party tech support hours. For instance, when if you're starting your phone bank at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, you might offer that people can join at 9:30 or 9:45 if they're still unsure about using Zoom, or they think they'll need a little extra help learning the phone bank tools. And you should just remind and support your volunteers before the time of the event. Mobilize does a pretty good job in helping you remind your volunteers. They will send several reminders, email reminders, and a text to help you them remember to show up. But you may want to send your own email also. So let's talk about some tips and tricks about how to make your event go smoothly during the event. So these virtual hosting tips are general tips that may be true for any type of event, but let's talk through them. They can be helpful for your remote phone bank. So remember, when you generally have an in-person event, people are joining, they're informally introducing each other, they may be greeted before things get going. There's a transition into an event if you're hosting a phone bank in person. Now that we're virtual, it can be sort of jarring to jump into a Zoom meeting from the comfort of your home. So make sure you're always doing introductions and that you welcome people. You may not have everyone go around and introduce themselves on the Zoom if there are a lot of people. You could do that if it's a small group. But if there are a lot, you can have them introduce themselves in the chat and say where they're joining from. You can tell them a little about you and your co-host. All of those things can help people get started. You should always make sure you're providing help on video conferencing. Remind people at the beginning how to mute, unmute, leave computer audio, join computer audio, and how to use the chat. You can make these phone banks fun, especially if you have regular ones. You might want to do themes. You might want to take some breaks during the phone bank, offer trivia or other games like that. Co-hosts, again, as I've mentioned before, really helpful to make sure that your virtual hosting goes smoothly. If there are multiple people who need tech support at the same time, that can get really crazy. So having a co-host is really important. Make tech support easy to find. That, as we mentioned before, many of you may have people stay on the phone bank while they make calls, and then it's pretty easy for them to ask for help in the chat. But you can also let them know if they do leave the Zoom, how to get back in touch with you, tell them just to join the Zoom again, or provide them some contact information. Debriefs using breakout rooms are another idea. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. So training volunteers. You're either going to be training volunteers the day of your phone bank or before, but there's a few key steps to consider. You should always train your volunteers in some way, even if it's just providing a very detailed volunteer instructions sheet. If you are letting people make calls on their own in a flexible phone bank. You probably will need to adjust your training based on the set of volunteers you have, newbies or repeat callers. You might want to consider offering additional training to those who are new, but letting your veterans start calling. You can use breakout rooms in Zoom for this type of thing. You should have a way, as I mentioned, that people can get tech support even after they've had the training. And if you need help with your training, feel free to reach out to the campaign or us at Swing Left. Here's an example training agenda that you can see on the right. This is a pretty extensive one, so it may or may not be everything, you may or may not want to include all of this when you train, but it gives you a sense of the types of points you would want to touch on. Purpose and goals, why are you making these calls, the specific information, background information they need to know about the script, candidates, issues, the targets, who you're calling, script information. You can potentially do a role play around that, you and your co-host or you and a veteran volunteer. Then doing some tech training and training on how to code the data or record the data that the volunteers are being asked to record when they make calls. And then you might want to also remind everyone about phone banking best practices. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail next. And then tell everyone what to do from there. Should they start calling? When should they come back for a debrief? All the specific things they need to do. So this is a lot in the agenda. You may move it around in a different order, but some ideas to get you started putting your agenda together. Phone banking best practices. There are a lot, and in our remote phone banking host kit, there is a link to that you can see at the bottom of this slide also to phone bank best practices. It's a one-pager. You can just make a copy of and send to your volunteers. A few key things that you want to make sure you mention though is that they need to set the right expectations. A contact rate of 10% is normal. So you want to make sure people know that they may not talk to a lot of people, and there may be a lot of time in between the time when they're talking to people. They may have to dial a lot of numbers before they get someone, or if they're on a predictive dialer, they may need to sit for a long time before they get connected with someone. That's normal, that's fine. Every call makes a big difference. They should try not to take anything personally if somebody hangs up or is rude to them. It's great if they can smile, because that will make them feel more energetic and help them, talk to the caller or talk to the voter in a way that makes them sound engaging. The scripts, part of that is also the script. You should put the script, your volunteer should put the script in their own words, but they shouldn't change the meaning. The scripts are developed for a particular reason, and so it's good to try to follow them, but it's okay to put it in your own words. That keeps you from sounding like a robot or not really connecting with the voter on the other end. So make the script yourselves, but make sure you're keeping the meaning. So the debrief, as I mentioned before, the debrief is an important part of your phone bank. Why is that? Because if you were having an in-person phone bank, likely when someone's done calling, you or another phone bank host would go up to them and have a chat with them, talk to them about a potential time that they can join for the next phone bank shift, find out how it went. None of that happens or happens naturally if they're just making calls from home while on a Zoom. They can just shut the Zoom down and walk away without you even knowing. So it's really helpful to have some sort of wrap up at the end to drive volunteer engagement, give them a chance to give feedback and get thoughts on what went well and what didn't go well, and also to help drive encourage them to sign up for another shift because they feel heard and engaged. So there's a lot of ways you can do this, and it can really depend on how many people you have making those phone calls and have in your debrief. If you have a big group, you can put them in breakout rooms on your video conference tool and have them discuss with each other what they experienced. As you can see, there's a Google Doc image in this slide from a debrief that I did. I gave everyone access to a Google Doc, and I split them up into breakout rooms, and one person in each breakout room took notes as they went through the questions listed at the top of the Google Doc. That can work, or it can be done more informally. I've done that also, where it's a smaller group of people and I've just brought them back together for 20 minutes at the end of the phone bank and asked them, people just to volunteer either in chat or by unmuting themselves, how the calls went or feedback they have or thoughts that they had. There's a few example discussion questions here, but this will really be vary based on your specific phone bank and what you're trying to get out of it. The key is really helpful to do some type of debrief so the volunteers come back for more. So great, you've run a wonderful remote phone bank. Everyone had a good time and felt accomplished. What should you do after the event? You'll want to go into Mobilize and update your event on who showed up and who didn't. You'll want to post your next phone bank or other event at swingleft.org/events like you did this event. And then reach out to your volunteers. You can do that through Mobilize. You can email them and thank them and invite them to the next one. Make sure you keep them going with their activism and their involvement with Swing Left. There is a link here, which is also in the remote phone bank guide on the right, which helps you get information about sending emails through Mobilize, as I mentioned, and updating your event at the end of the event. So there's some tips there that you can that will walk you through everything you need to know. Wonderful. So thank you for joining us today. Here are some resources that you can take advantage of to help you continue to prepare for hosting a remote phone bank. We have our full remote phone bank host kit and guide. You can access it at this URL, swingleft.org/remote-phone-bank-guide. There are a number of different resources linked in that host kit and guide. There's a data coding cheat sheet that you can offer to your volunteers or use to help train. There's an example volunteer instructions template that you can copy and use. There's a sample phone bank orientation training presentation template you can copy and use. And there's phone banking best practices one-pager that you can also download or copy and send to your volunteers, as well as lots of other information about all the things that I walked through today to help you set up your remote phone bank. And then you can also go to our virtual organizing hub, swingleft.org/virtual-organizing, to get help getting access to video conferencing resources or numerous other trainings or things that you might need. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful remote phone bank, and we so appreciate you being part of our community.